Welcome to Cross Connections, Season 2, Cover to Cover, as we read along with you each week and discuss the Bible from Genesis to Revelation. Join us as we discover how these stories connect us to God, to our inner selves, and to one another in a world that tries so hard to disconnect us. I'm Natalee Hill, and I'm joined by
Elliot Van Hoy
and Rick Morley.
We are about to go a little bit more into a geek out session.
We do not want to make things more complicated for people who just don't want to be more complicated. But for those that would like a little more complexity, we're going
to get a little bit more complex. And I think we were going to start with this conversation about the authorship.
Yeah. So you may have noticed that there's a first creation story. It's 7 days. God is regal. God is creating by dictate, speaks words and they happen. God is large and in charge, and everything is so ordered, and this is created and that's created, and it's good and it's very good. And then there's a break in the beginning of the second chapter, and now all of a sudden God's like walking around the garden,
right.
And God is presented very differently, and then the animals haven't like really been created yet, and then the animals get brought out before Adam, and Adam's naming them. They're talking back and forth. There are two stories of creation which lead us to believe that there were two stories that were edited together here. And so modern biblical scholarship has suggested that there are 4 main strands of authors of what the Pentateuch, the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible. And we can identify that by the doubling of stories, and there's several stories that are doubled. For people who are conversant in Hebrew, we can tell that Hebrew is different in these different strands. It's like Old Hebrew and Middle Hebrew.
So it's like as if you were listening, like somebody wrote it in the King James Shakespeare.
It's exactly
versus,
right. And then in these different streams, God is referred to differently. Mm-hmm. So one of the streams is called J, after the Yahwist, because he's always calling God Yahweh.
Right.
But then there's this other strand, which is called E, because he always calls God Elohim. And there's a Deuteronomist who writes most of the book of Deuteronomy and is concerned with this sort of second giving of the law. And then there's this priestly writer who we call P, who is really concerned with things that priests would be concerned about. So this is new information for me, or maybe I heard this before and forgot it.
Yeah.
So are you talking about 4 individual authors? Is that the theory, or is it
4 different
like
teams of authors?
Yeah. Okay.
4 different eras of authorship. We don't think it's like the letters of Paul, where Paul sat down and he wrote Romans, right?
Right.
Like this
is some group of people who sat down and wrote this together, or over some course of time.
And we can see that there are differences in concern, and there are differences in how they write things. Like the priests were very concerned with order. Mm-hmm. And so we think that the first chapter of Genesis was written by the priestly author. Everything happens orderly one day, the next day, the firmament, the waters above, the waters below, everything is like very clear and laid out perfectly. And then this much older author, this Yahwist, writes the second chapter.
Right. Yep. Starting in chapter 2:4, right? So you see that transition in chapter 2, verse 4, where you've had this creation story, and it goes into chapter 2 with the 7th day, right? And then there's these shifts throughout the primeval history, and the Greek is, the Hebrew, and forgive me always for my Hebrew pronunciation, it's horrible, but toledot or toledoth, generations. This is the Hebrew word for generations or descendants. So you'll see throughout the primeval history this language of these are the generations of, or these are the descendants of, and that marks a transition. And interestingly enough, there's one in chapter 2, verse 4, right? So it says, these are the generations of the heavens and the earth when they were created. And then it's almost like, there's a new story that begins right then.
Yeah.
And it's in the day that the Lord God made the earth and the heavens. And this creation account is much more, people would characterize it as anthropomorphic. More, God is presented much more human-like. Like Rick said, God is walking and the mists are in the field. And, when Adam and Eve hide, God is like, where are you?
Where are you?
Yeah.
Right. The God of the first chapter of Genesis would never ask, where are you? Because that God is large and in charge.
Right.
But now God's like, and what happened? How do you know you're naked?
Yes.
Right? Like,
he's like talking and he's asking them questions, and there's differences in what happens. Like, just to be completely honest, right? Like, Natalie, you pointed this out before we got on this episode, is that in the first one, it talks about on the sixth day, God created male and female. He created them in their image. And really, there's not even a characterization of creating like distinct individuals. But in chapter 2, in the second account, it's a little bit different. God creates Adam, and then after that, he creates all of these animals that come to Adam, and he names them. And then it's only then that God creates Eve from out of Adam, right? So like, there's some differences here, which speak to your point, Rick, of like, there are these different oral and written traditions that have been brought together into this one text.
So the other place you can see this is in Noah's story, and if you Google this, you can. There are places on the web that will pull out the two. It's basically two stories that are knit together,
right?
And you can pull them out. And the easiest place to see it is in one verse. It'll say the animals are coming on in 2 by 2. In another verse, we hear that they're coming on in sevens. Wait, what?
Yeah, right.
That was not in my child's nursery. We didn't
always
have
heard too. Yeah.
7 giraffes sticking their heads out of the ark or anything like that. And that's because
It's not in the it's not in the Rise and Shine song either.
it's not in the Rise.
No,
I love
it
that
isn't.
song. The priestly author who writes one of those chapters would never have thought that anyone would sacrifice anything if they weren't a priest. And Noah was not a priest. He was not ordained to be a priest. The other author of the other story has Noah sacrificing animals after they land the ark. Well, if you only have 2 of each kind and Noah starts killing them, then you have just wiped out entire species.
It's not going to work.
But they came off the ark in threesies. Sorry.
That's
Of course.
that's in that other ancient text.
We're geeking out and we're just adding some levity here.
But no, that is such a great example, and it shows the differences in concerns for some of these sources. Like this priestly source, as you said, is really concerned with sacrifice because at the time that they're writing, this is something that is very important to Israel. Right. But this older source that recounts just the 2 by 2, it's not really worried about, is Noah going to make a sacrifice to God?
Not at all.
Because that hasn't really happened in Israel's history yet.
Right.
I think, and you mentioned this very briefly, Rick, but one of the things that makes this understanding very convincing to me is the way scholars will talk about different uses of God's name. Mm-hmm. And in the Hebrew, this is very, very clear. In the English translation, it's not so clear. So in the Hebrew, in these accounts, the 2 different names used, which Rick has kind of mentioned, are Yahweh and then Elohim. So these are 2 different words for God's name. Elohim is a very general name for God.
Is there like a specific translation to either
Yes,
of those?
I'm getting there.
Okay, sorry.
So Elohim is a very generic name for God. In fact, in the ancient Near East, El is just God. That would have been the name for any God. And Yahweh is the specific name that God reveals to Moses in Exodus chapter 6. That's where he says, I am the Lord, right? And so this is the English translation. When you're reading these first chapters of Genesis, when you see the word Lord, and typically, I think in mine, let me double check, sometimes it will be, in some translations, all capitalized, Lord, which it is in mine. And that's actually letting you know, traditionally, when Yahweh was written in Hebrew, it's written YHWH, because there's no vowels in Hebrew. That is a whole nother nerdy conversation to get into. But that's way down the rabbit trail. But the point is, when you see Lord, that's translating the Hebrew Yahweh. When you see God, that's translating the Hebrew Elohim. And so if you're still tracking with me, in the first, let's see here, let me make sure I get this right. In the first account of creation, the only word used for God is Elohim. Yep. In the second account of creation, the word Yahweh or Lord is used. And so a lot of scholars will say this really is kind of quintessential of these two different traditions. And as Rick said, there's kind of different time frames for them. Typically, it would be understood that if a source is only using the word God, it's an older tradition.
Yep.
And if it's using the word Lord, it's a newer tradition. It's a less old tradition because it's using this name that was revealed to. Or I'm getting that backwards. So one of the other, there's different debates on which comes first and second, but it's kind of identifying that these are two different traditions of talking about God. So that's a lot. I hope that wasn't too.
So that's really interesting because I had sort of noticed
Yeah,
that sometimes
right.
we were using God and sometimes we were using Lord, but it wasn't until you pointing it out now, explaining how that's appearing in the English translation, the Yahweh Elohim.
Right.
It's not until you're mentioning it that I'm like, oh, I did sort of
Totally.
notice that.
Yep. And a lot of times in English, you're just like, that's kind of weird. Why is it flipping back and forth? But when Rick's highlighted all these differences, like with the 7 animals versus the 2, if you go back and you look at that passage, one is using the word God, one is using the word Lord. So you can really see, as Rick really perfectly said, it's these two traditions being interwoven and knit together.
I love this because once you can pull out a tradition and you can sort of locate where that tradition might have come from and what was going on historically, you can then see them speak to the concerns of their time. So in Genesis 1, written by the priestly source, we think that it was sometime around the Babylonian captivity, probably an out-of-work priest who no longer had a temple because the temple was destroyed in 587. And so they're writing this in Babylon. So Eliot talked about the Enuma Elish, which was the creation story of the Babylonians.
Oh,
this priest would have known that story because he's living in that land. And in the Enuma Elish, the gods create the world out of an act of violence.
Yeah,
they basically jump a god and they kill her and they rip her apart and they create the universe out of her entrails.
Right.
And then they kill another god and they create humanity out of his blood. And you see in Genesis 1, this Jewish priest or this Jewish set of priests say, no. God does not create out of an act of violence. God creates out of an act of creativity. God speaks and it happens. And then, no, we are not created to be slaves. And they were slaves in Babylon. We're not created for this. We're created to reflect the image of our God. I mean, it was directly theologically opposed to the theological concerns of where they were geographically and in time.
Right. So it really helps you understand the purpose of these texts. And it might be worth saying, because we jumped right into this, that this is a little bit different than the way traditionally Genesis was understood to be written and composed. Typically, it is understood that the author is Moses, which we will see a little bit later when we get into some later texts. A lot of people traditionally believe that when Moses was on Mount Sinai, he's there for 40 days, and Exodus talks about God giving Moses the law, the Torah, and ancient interpreters would say, well, he was there 40 days. That's a long, 40 days and 40 nights. That's a long time to receive.
For the 10 Commandments.
10 Commandments.
Right,
so from there, it was traditionally thought, oh, well,
he wrote
God must have revealed the Pentateuch, the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible to Moses, and he wrote it all down at that time. I think for reasons we've already articulated, that probably is not the way that Genesis or the first 5 books of the Bible were written, and that's okay.
and there are still Christians, and Orthodox Jews who absolutely believe that Moses wrote the Torah. Even the parts about his death and what happened after his death.
Yeah, right.
But
Like
biblical
vision?
scholarship, basic biblical scholarship, any seminary in the Western world is going to be like, no, it was at least 4 sources.
Yeah.
It might be new to a lot of people, but it's like, it is.
I imagine it will.
This is a really important point to understand. I think that explaining that it's coming from 4 different sources and the stories are repeated and they're not the same is important to understand. When sometimes people get stuck in early stories and use them as a reason to say, well, this is this because it says it this way in the Bible.
Right.
It's like, well, but it also says it this other way. So
Right.
But as Christians, it continues to be part of our tradition. Like, we start the New Testament not with one gospel, but with 4.
Yeah.
God did not
That's a
just
great
speak
point.
the
Yeah.
story of Jesus to one person and they wrote it down and that was it. God spoke to 4 people, and these 4 people wrote down the story, and they wrote it down differently.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of overlap,
Yeah.
but the stories are different.
Which feels
And-
very human. Like that's how we
Yes.
remember
Yes.
stories.
Yes.
There's this sort of like myth that the modern Western world loves, that like the Bible, I think maybe we did this
Yeah, we talked-
podcast
I
or
was
2
just
ago,
about to go
that
here.
The Bible just like descends to earth with
Divinely.
a leather cover and gold gilt edging.
Right.
And this sounds like, oh, maybe it's less spiritual. Like,
Yeah,
oh, it's
right.
like more scholarly and it's a little cold. And I think this is where the spirituality is, because God spoke to this people, and then God spoke to those people, and then God spoke to another people, and then God spoke to a people that like edited the thing together. It is God continuing in relationship. It's not just a data dump and then God's out of there. I think it's beautiful, and I think it's deeply infused with
Yeah, I couldn't put
theology
it any,
and spirituality.
Couldn't put it any better myself, Rick. I think that is a
man.
great way to approach it.
Thank you.
And
But
there's-
I do think I do want to say really quick, because I'm glad you said something, Natalie, because I do think for certain types of Christians, certainly not all Christians, but I can relate as someone that grew up in a Baptist tradition that views the Bible as the Word of God, right? And views it very highly, very authoritatively, as all 3 of us do.
Yep.
But I think that understanding really necessitates there is at least a misconception that, oh, it has to be, word for word. This has to be exactly, it has to be Moses wrote it and it was directly given by God. And I think you articulated really well, Rick, that there is this alternative way of understanding it that is just as beautiful, if not maybe more beautiful. And it's complex and it's messy, yes, just like the Gospels, but that actually almost speaks to God's relationship to us in an even deeper way. Like these stories, in the messiness of life, in the complexity of life, that there are all of these traditions and revelations and communities that are bringing this text together in really beautiful ways.
And that God is speaking to specific people in their specific, geographic and geography and time.
Yeah.
Like this is how you can see your life through the lens of how I created the universe, or the origin of our nation, or the coming of Jesus. They're not generic stories. They are specific stories and told for specific people. And I think that's how we can then interface and interact and realize God is speaking in our own time.
And I think it's important from the very get-go that relationship is clearly very important to all of the authors of this, that in the one, God creates humanity in God's image. There's a real intimate relationship there.
Yeah.
In the other, God creates Adam as, out of a desire for another presence, I'll say.
Yeah.
Again, deep relationship there. So right from the get-go, these stories are establishing God's desire for relationship with all of humanity as well as individual persons right away. And that's a really theologically beautiful thing to kind of carry through the whole way.
And it talks about the complexity of human relationships and the messiness, and that sometimes they go off the rails. And then, Cain kills Abel, and then Noah gets drunk, and then Abraham gives his wife away again. And then, the relationship is the key, and relationship is hard.
Yeah.
You can't find direct correlations all the time to precisely the thing in your life, but probably somewhere in the Bible you're going to run into it.
right.
Something similar-ish.
Yeah. Any other things we can nerd out about that we haven't? So we talked a little bit about authors and these different accounts of creation and the animals entering the ark. Anything else we can nerd out about in these chapters?
I will say, can I just give a resource?
Yes.
So there is, I guess we can put it in the show notes, Richard Elliott Friedman's The Bible with Sources Revealed, which is the first 5 books of the Bible, and they put the 4 strands of J, E, P, and D in a different color and font. So you can sort of read through them and see when those voices go back and forth. There's also a new translation. I could not find it. I'm still unpacking my books, but a new translation of the P source called The Consuming Fire, which I did last year for Advent. I just read the P source of the Pentateuch, and it was kind of wild and wonderful, just to kind of like dig into how God was speaking to
Absolutely,
to
a lot
those
less
people.
reading too.
It was a kind of a thick book, but
Maybe we can, Natalie, make sure to link both of those in the show notes.
Absolutely.
For people that might want to check them out and have some fun New Year's reading.
It's really interesting too that there's some the scholarly research continues. There's still more to dig out from this. It's here for us to access now, and there's still more to dig into all the time.
Absolutely. I have some thoughts on some other geeky, nerdy things if we want to keep going a little bit. So one would maybe be to open the question for you two. Any thoughts on what is up with this whole covenant thing? What is a covenant? What's going on with those? There's one for Noah and one for Abraham here. Are those important? How do we understand them? I don't know. I thought maybe we might want to geek out about what's going on there.
Well, I don't know. I've taught some Sunday school kids that covenants are really important moments, and that big things happen. Like you get a name change when you have a covenant made with you. Not Noah, but Abram and Sarai became Abraham and Sarah. That's one of the marks of that, in addition to the circumcision. But, it's a really special moment between the people and God, where God makes a great big promise to the people and puts a sign out there.
Yeah, that promise. That seems like a key word.
I mean, it kind of goes back to what you were saying, Natalie, about relationship, right? This is it's sort of like how a wedding is the formal demarcation of a married couple, right? Like it's the moment when you get married. This is the moment when the relationship between God and Abraham and his family is ratified, and God makes promises, and God has expectations in return from Abraham and his family. One of them is kind of strange. It's this whole circumcision thing, but there's both parties in this relationship are meant to be active and faithful to it.
Yeah, I think the word promise really comes to mind with the word covenant. Those two go hand in hand. And I think with one of the things you said, Rick, marriage is a helpful example. We often think of marriage as a covenant now, but I think one of the things that I like to think about, especially in these sections with covenant, is that it's very different than just a contract. That it is actually, like you said, it's a relationship where both parties are involved. So I don't know. Yeah, just thinking about that. I do think one of the interesting things, this is casting way ahead, that's quite geeky, but that, again, with these different sources, there are 2 different accounts of God's covenant with Abraham. There's the one in Genesis chapter 15, and then there's the one in Genesis chapter 17. And the important distinction between these 2 is that in Genesis chapter 15, when God makes his covenant with Abraham, there is not a requirement of circumcision. And this is the one, right, where it's the very weird one. They pass through the animals and birds that have been cut in half, which, if you're a study Bible person, this is kind of like their antecedents of this in the ancient Near East. This was a ceremony that was done to establish a relationship between 2 parties. But then in 17, there's none of the cut in half birds or animals, but then there's the requirement of circumcision, which is just...
Both require blood.
Yeah, both do require blood. And it is interesting that kind of speaks to these two different sources potentially as well. And then also my one last really nerdy, geeky thing is Paul makes a really big deal about this actually, that Paul uses this difference in 15 and 17. And in particular, he thinks the verse in 15, verse 6 is really important. And he believed the Lord and the Lord reckoned it to him as righteousness.
Right.
And we'll get into this way down the road. But Paul thinks it's really important that this happens before God tells Abraham that he and his descendants need to be circumcised. Paul thinks this is a really big deal for this question of whether or not Gentiles need to be circumcised.
Which is the question of the early church.
Which is the question of the
First
early church. And Paul is returning to this source here in the very beginning of Genesis to help him answer that question.
Right.
So I just think, and what he ends up saying is that Gentiles don't need to be circumcised. And I mean, this is a live question in the early church. There were Christians, and you can even see this in our own Bible, that kind of thought,
Acts, Galatians.
yeah,
Yep.
kind of thought that you needed to be circumcised to follow Jesus.
Well, it's really clear here in Genesis 17 that this is an everlasting covenant.
Everlasting.
Everyone has to do it. Right. The slave living in your household, the foreigner who comes to live with you, your children. You must be circumcised. If you're not, you are cut off. Blah 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 blah.
Yep.
And then Paul's like, nah,
right?
nah.
Maybe it's not that important.
Nah, let's just do away with that.
So we'll
covenants. So see, even in the early church, they're sitting there going back to their original texts, going, "Well, there's two versions. So which one's the right one?"
Well, and like in Acts chapter 15, you can see the argument, and you can see like the people going, well, my Bible says in Genesis 17 that everyone needs to be circumcised.
Yeah.
And then you see another group of people being like, well, I think God's doing something else.
Yeah,
so this is just a heads up for anybody who's made it this long. Pay real close attention to what you're reading now, because it's going to come back up again a lot later. And that's one of the fun things about reading the whole Bible cover to cover is that you find all these little things, and then when you get to it later in the Gospels,
it pays off.
And it pays off, and you go, wait.
Yes.
I remember reading that back in February.
Really? Yes. I mean, I'm like freaking out over here as Natalie's saying this, and you can't see that, but it's like this really is the beauty of Rick having us read it cover to cover, because this is what you miss oftentimes, is that these stories, all the way from here in Genesis to Galatians, which is almost at the end of the Bible, are connected.
Yep.
And you miss that. You miss that when you don't get to read it cover to cover. So I hope you make it with us all the way to Galatians. That's quite a ways
beyond.
away. But we can do this together, and we promise it will pay off.
Yep.
And there's always some funny stuff along the way. I feel like one of the things we should touch on before we go is some of the ridiculousness that we've had in these verses.
Yeah.
Or just weird. Like, where did that come from?
Right.
You're in the middle of a genealogy and they tell you about Nimrod. And I know that Nimrod these days is used as an insult, but Nimrod was a great warrior.
That's right.
But it's just kind of a throwaway mention in there.
Yeah. That is one of the funny ones.
And then what was the other one I came across? I was like, what is this?
Yeah.
One of the Enochs.
Enoch walked with God.
Walked with God. Very specific.
Didn't
they
die.
Pulled that out. And then Enoch, much shorter, what we would say lifespan, made it 300 some odd years. And then God took him away.
With God. That's it.
Just walks with God forever. What is that? No further information.
Nope. Right. You don't need to know that.
Nope.
I think we didn't get to talk too much about Sarah and Hagar, but one of my favorite things in all of the Bible and in this section from this week is when Hagar names God. Hagar is really one of
sees.
El Roy, the God who sees. I mean, she's really one of the only characters in the entire Bible that names God. So often it's God.
And her name literally means foreign thing.
Yeah, right. Coming from this Egyptian woman who's a slave.
She is as low as can be.
Right.
And God hears her, sees her, and she names God as this God saw me.
Yep.
And even if God can see her in the biblical text, then there's no one that God can't see.
Yep. Yeah. So I think that's a good one that we missed, but one of those small things. Yeah. But maybe not that small,
No, that one seems like a pretty big one.
Right.
I mean, because now you're talking about the foundations of Islam.
Yeah.
Because she's the mother.
Right, of Ishmael.
Yep.
Yeah, and then the Ishmaelites. Yeah. Yep.
And we're going to see the Ishmaelites again.
Yes.
Before we,
yes, we will.
Yeah.
another week or so.
Yeah, that's the other thing that you don't want to get too lost in the names in here, but you're going to find these names really familiar because the names of these peoples are going to come up again.
Yep.
Right. Right. Yeah, the Canaanites, I think that's a big one to keep an eye on. This is the land that Abraham comes into, so just being aware of that. This is the land that God is giving Abraham.
And I think if you go back, Canaan comes from one of Cain's children. So
one of Noah's, it's his
Noah's
grandson, technically, right? Because it's, let me see if I can get this right. It's Noah's son, Ham. It's his son, Canaan.
Wow.
And this is who Noah curses.
Right.
If you picked up on that.
He looked on his
because
nakedness.
Ham looked on his nakedness, which it's very bizarre. Like Ham looks on his nakedness, but then Noah curses Canaan, which isn't the son. It's Ham's son, because the three sons are Shem, Ham, and the one that starts with J. Yeah, however you pronounce that. So yeah, it's this very bizarre passage, and that's kind of part of the explanation of why Canaan will get to belong to Israel is because of this act that Ham did. There's also, this is a really random, nerdy thing that pops up. There is a whole tradition of this curse that Noah gives to Canaan in older translations of the Bible that mistranslated this passage, and people thought that the curse was on Ham. And if you go, have you heard of this, Rick? No. Yeah, you're looking at me surprised. I took a class on race and ethnicity in the Hebrew Bible at my time at Princeton, and this is like this huge history where there were mistranslations of the Bible in the 1700s, 1800s, 1900s that translated it as Noah cursing Ham, which isn't what happens. Noah curses Canaan.
Yes.
Ham, when you go and read these genealogies and the peoples that descend from them, the people that descend from Ham are Egypt and Cush and these people in Africa. And they developed this whole tradition where it was understood that Noah cursed Ham, and that's the people of Africa. And that's why they are black instead of white. And this was actually a story, not to get too serious here, but a story that was used to justify modern kind of chattel slavery.
Whoa.
Yeah. Sorry to get really deep really quick. Kind of a story about how the Bible can be used, especially mistranslations of the Bible in terrible ways. But yeah, there was this whole way of thinking that Noah cursed Ham. So by God, but by definition, God had cursed this group of people, and that made it okay to enslave them. So we can do a whole nother, sorry to end us on a very morbid note.
Well, I was just going to talk about Moab and where Moab comes from with one of Lot's daughters, and then Ruth being a Moabite.
Yes.
Which is a little bit lighter.
That is, but that's still a good example. Yeah, the Moabites, and what is it? The other one's the
Ammonites.
The Ammonites. There's this story that is kind of justifying that their origin supposedly was in this incestual relationship, which really, this is going to be
redeemed in the story of Ruth.
Which gets redeemed in the story of Ruth, and also gets used in more negative ways to kind of justify Israel taking over some of these places, which we'll be able to talk a lot more about that. Sorry to take us. I don't want
to get too much into gosh, is that when he goes into somebody else's territory and God says this is going to be yours, I'm starting to get is this some sort of colonization thing going on? And, you got to just get tricky because these are ancient stories, and it does. I'm not. Now you're starting to hear it and color it with some of your modern understandings.
Right.
But,
we'll get into that.
But we'll get into that more because it's been used that way.
Yeah.
So
it's important. Important to know the ways it's been used. I think an important thing as we read it for the year.
So don't get too lost, but
you've really geeked out if you've made it.
Come back.
No, if you've made it this far, congratulations.
Come back to next week. It's okay.
Come back next week. We're gonna keep reading Genesis. We're gonna make it almost to the end of Genesis by next week's podcast.
We'll be right at the end.
That'll be exciting.
Talking about Abraham and Isaac, some crazy stories that happen here at the end of Genesis. Joseph, right?
Oh yeah.
Right, going down to Egypt.
Dream code.
Yeah. Going to be some really fun stuff to talk about.
We got some great stuff coming up. So please continue reading along. If you haven't started yet, you can feel free to catch up. But thank you for listening to this episode of Cross Connections, Cover to Cover. New episodes drop each Wednesday. Be sure to follow or like us on your favorite podcasting app to find us easily each week, or join our email list at stdavidschurch.org Cross Connections. If you have questions, if we did not cover something in this very thorough episode, please give us a call at 484-588-5656 and leave a voicemail with your name, where you're from, and your question or comment. Please note we may use your recorded voice in an upcoming episode of Cross Connections. If you like what you hear, we'd love it if you would share this with your friends and rate us in Spotify and Apple Podcasts so other people can find us as well. Don't forget to visit our show notes for the year's reading list and the resources for some of the things that we've mentioned. Cross Connections is a ministry of St. David's Church in Wayne, Pennsylvania. Season 2, Cover to Cover, is hosted by
Morley,
Elliot Van Hoy,
and Natalee Hill. Logo graphic design and podcast production by Natalee Hill. Stock media music provided by Marscott and Mood Mode Pond 5. You're welcome to learn more about all of St. David's worship and ministries at stdavidschurch.org. Thanks for listening.